Welcome everyone, Costin here with my racial ranking for Total War Warhammer 3, patch 4.0. I like to do these kind of videos from time to time, just with every major patch, update things if necessary based on what things may have changed or things that I've learned, because as you put in more and more hours in the game, hundreds and hundreds of hours on top of each other, you do learn certain things, how certain things stack up, how good certain races are, how bad certain races are as well, in many different ways. Now, I want to be very clear, this is not a video about pure racial strength, because if I wanted to just consider pure racial strength, I would put Warriors of Chaos and Wood Elves far above every other race in the game. That's because it's very easy for them in their campaigns to steamroll every single one of their opponents. You know, you could also put Siege, if you're considering the Changeling, at a fairly high position on this list. That's not what I want to do, because to me what really matters is like how good is it to actually play certain races on the campaign map, how well designed are their campaigns, how well designed are the races for campaigns, be it in the short term, medium term, long term, all of those kind of things. Now, of course, I am considering the campaign perspective. I'm not talking about skirmish, I'm not talking about multiplayer, I'm not considering lower difficulty. So this is designed with Legendary in mind. Replayability is also a factor when we're talking about this, because you might have a campaign that can be fun once, but after that you probably never want to play it again. So with that in mind, well, let's start with the Beastmen. From my perspective, the Beastmen are a B tier race. They have a lot of potential in their campaigns, be it lords, legendary lords, heroes, units. But the problem is, the Beastmen and their rework made sense within the context of Warhammer 3. It doesn't work so well within the context of... it made sense within the context of Warhammer 2. It doesn't make so much sense within the context of Warhammer 3. The reason it doesn't work quite as well in Warhammer 3 as opposed to 2 is Warhammer 3 is very front heavy. So the portions of the campaign that matter the most, the meat of any particular campaign, is going to be in the early game. The first 20, 30 turns, then the mid game to an extent, but the late game, past like turn 60, 70, is generally the weakest portion of the game. Now, the Beastmen struggle in the early game, and it's not necessarily that they're challenging, far from it. In fact, they're not necessarily so challenging. I mean, Kazrak has a difficult early turn 1 battle situation, but outside of that, you don't really have that necessarily that huge of a challenge, unless you're trying to do some crazy stuff like wiping out the Leaf and R very quickly as Tarox, sure. But it's like, it's very slow, because you're limited to one army, you're limited in terms of your units, you're also limited by design as a race in terms of diplomacy. You don't really have a lot of diplomatic options, as the Beastmen and a lot of people, in fact the vast majority of factions on the campaign map, do hate you. So you end up in a fairly limited early game and even mid game in the campaign. And actually the best thing you can do as the Beastmen is endure that horrible early game to build up a lot of dread, to increase army capacity, and then start worrying about the unit caps, hero caps, legendary lords, and so on. And that's just not a great campaign design that any of the Beastmen legendary lords have to deal with. Again, it's a question of design philosophy from Warhammer 2 versus Warhammer 3. Warhammer 2, it could work. Warhammer 3 doesn't work necessarily quite as well with that. Like in Warhammer 2, the Beastmen having only one armor early on was pretty fine, because supply lines, right? That factions had to deal with. But in Warhammer 3, and this is something that's going to come up again and again, in Warhammer 3 it's not just good enough to have one army, it's the races that are the best to play in a campaign are the ones that can maintain a lot of armies very quickly in a campaign that are good quality, and the Beastmen just don't have that working for them. They're not completely awful, their design isn't completely broken, but they just don't quite fit very well within the context of a Warhammer 3 campaign. If they started with an extra army, if increasing unit caps was easier, sure, but it's not. Then we have Britannia, also a B tier race. Now, Britannia's issues are of a different nature. Britannia does have a good economy, they can maintain more armies, they're not horrible in terms of diplomacy, but they do have two major issues as far as I see it. One, their unit roster is not particularly great for the kind of campaigns you're going to play within the context of Warhammer 3. What do I mean by that? Well, you have a lot of siege battles if you're playing a Warhammer 3 campaign. And Britannia is particularly bad at siege battles because they're mainly focused on cavalry. They do have artillery, that they can get access early on in their campaign, and they have some of the best growth, if not the best growth of settlements of any faction in the entire game, good economy. But the problem is they just end up being limited by their unit roster. Like if their knights could dismount, that would be a different affair, but they can't. Like there are some mods that apparently are working on it. I think SFO is actually going to do that. But vanilla-wise, Britannia just ends up being fairly limited because of their unit roster. Another issue is the issue of vows. So most races, when you're looking at them, actually every other race, when you're talking about getting immortal heroes, immortal lords, they just get that by default once they reach a certain rank. Britannia needs to do a vow for that. And what's annoying about those vows is not only do you have to unlock it on every lord and hero, but you also end up in this kind of situation where you have to go out of your way to do certain objectives in a certain way. And in particular, like requiring a jungle battle, for instance, as an example. Just one particular example, or siege battle, or eliminating legendary lords to fulfill a vow. It is something that kind of worked again in Warhammer 2, not necessarily so much in Warhammer 3, because you do obviously want to maintain a lot of heroes. There's mods that help with this and do elevate Britannia, but between the unit roster and the vow situation, it isn't a great campaign dynamic. Also, I have to say that the Fey Enchantress and Leonliankur and their campaigns are pretty damn terrible in a lot of ways. It's workable, but there's a lot of limitations you'll have to deal with in those campaigns. You will enjoy an Alberic campaign, and especially a Rapun's campaign, far more, I would argue. Then we have Grand Cafe. Now, Grand Cafe is an A-tier race. I'm not quite willing to give them an S rank. As far as I'm concerned, an S rank is something for very special races that are extraordinary. But Cafe is a good race. They have a really strong unit roster from the very beginning. Their tier 1 unit from Barracks Jade Warriors are some of the best, if not the best, tier 1 units in the entire game. They have a lot of power, they have a good playstyle, they have a balanced unit roster. While they lack certain hero options, like they don't have a melee hero, and there are certainly limitations in their campaigns, they're in a pretty solid spot. What prevents Cafe from getting the S tier spot is this. With the exception of Yanbo, the Cafe campaigns are limited. So Miaoying, Xiaoming, they end up having limited campaigns because of climate. Because once you unify all of Cafe, you don't really have a whole lot of territory where you can go and take over. Like you could make your way to the Empire, but outside of that, like you're just very limited in campaign. And it actually hurts their long-term potential. So while Cafe is perfectly fine in the early game, mid-game, it's really the late game where they struggle significantly. And even in the mid-game, even in the mid-game, and I would consider like unifying Cafe like an early game situation with a bit of the mid-game, you do end up in that problem. Fairly strong race, relatively well designed, just limitations with climate, unless you're playing Yanbo. Like Yanbo is really the saving race for Cafe, and I would consider Yanbo an S-tier legendary lord, but not Cafe as a whole. Just too many issues, too many annoyances, including the constant attacks on the Great Bastion for rogue armies. That's not a great mechanic, and it has never been. It is in a better spot with 4.0 than it was before, and out of all the races in 4.0, which has a change, it's Cafe that ended up benefiting the most. Then we have the Chaos Dwarves, and the Chaos Dwarves are absolutely an S-tier race. Yes, I can actually say nice things about Warhammer 3, imagine that. Being critical doesn't mean being negative, I just want to make that point. Because some people accuse me of being overly negative. I'm like, no, I do criticize things, but I also do like quite a lot of things about Warhammer 3, including the Chaos Dwarves. I think like the Chaos Dwarves set a standard of DLC that Creative Assembly needs to carry forward. That they have not with Shadows of Change is a completely different discussion worthy of its own video. But it isn't a great situation what ended up happening with Shadows of Change. But Forge the Chaos Dwarves, great DLC, great race. What I like about the Chaos Dwarves is while they have unit caps and they have hard limits in their campaigns early on in the campaign, they do, unlike the Tomb Kings, unlike the Beastmen, they do have a fairly solid early game roster in Hobgoblins. So that's one of the ways that the Chaos Dwarves avoid the pitfalls of the Beastmen and Tomb Kings do have in their respective campaigns. They actually have a good early game army. But they do need to build up industry. What I like about the Chaos Dwarves, they are powerful, but they're not steamrolling the map. You have to work for it. You need to carefully construct your empire, manage the various resources you have in that empire, build up properly and balance things out between laborers, materials, armaments, influence. And that is a great situation. Also, one thing I like about the Chaos Dwarves is they can get a good amount of casualty replenishment, but the way that works is different than most other races. The way it works for most other races, either you have a hero that gives you good casualty replenishment or you don't. Chaos Dwarves manage it without having that hero, because either they get tech trees or skill trees on their lords that give them access to that quickly, or they have research that improves that, or they have the Tower of Zara that gives them that. One of the things that brings Cafe down, by the way, is the fact that they only have one choice really to improve casualty replenishment, and that's through the Compass, which can give you up to 10%. Chaos Dwarves can get more, and they can get it passively, so it ends up being a much better situation than what other factions may have to deal with. Like, Chaos Dwarves, you could say they were an experiment to introduce the mechanics of a Total War Saga Troy into Warhammer 3, and it was very successful. Some people complained about the lack of geographic diversity in the Chaos Dwarf campaigns, and we saw how well that ended in Shadows of the Change when they brought that geographic diversity. But I think the way they ended up designing the Chaos Dwarves, it was a focused campaign. It's focused on the Darklands, one way or another for all the Legendary Lords. Sure, different focuses like in the north, in the south, in the east against Cafe, dependent on which Legendary Lord you're talking about. But like a great set of campaigns with a biblical threat in terms of Grimgore. So really well-designed campaigns, well-designed race, where you have a decent amount of early game power, but you do really need to work for it in terms of late game power. And if you don't, if you screw that up, you will actually end up falling behind. So it is possible to actually end up failing, because your Hobgoblins, great units early on, but they won't hold against like late game units or mid game units even. So you need to build up for artillery, you need to build up for proper warriors, and so on. So you do have a balancing act, and you do have decisions and consequences for those decisions in a Chaos Dwarf campaign. Then we get into the Demons of Chaos. I'm not even going to talk about it. Really horrible. In fact, I would consider all the demonic races really horrible, one way or another, but I'll talk about them individually later on. But suffice to say, Daniel is in a really bad spot. Yuri, Daniel, the Demon Prince, the God Slayer, yeah, he's pathetic. And he's always been in a bad spot in his campaign since the launch of Warhammer 3. And I guess Creative Assembly doesn't care about fixing him anymore, because they haven't really put any effort towards that. Then we get the Dark Elves, S-tier race, easy S-tier as far as I'm concerned. This is one area where the opinion of the community, quote-unquote, or the Reddit meta, if you will, or the Reddit opinion, this is where I differ significantly. A lot of people do dislike how Creative Assembly has handled the Dark Elves in Warhammer 3, but make no mistake on this, the Dark Elves are one of the most powerful races in the game, and they're a scalable race. They have a good early game army, they have a good late game army, they have a good economy. In fact, I think from their economic structures, they can earn the most amount of cash of any race in the game. Other races may earn more for trade, other races may earn more for looting and sacking settlements, but the Dark Elves, like from their structures, they earn a lot. They also get the instant construction similar to the Chaos Dwarves using slaves. So there's a lot of potential in a Dark Elven campaign, and also, quite interestingly enough, a lot of diplomatic potential, whereas the Chaos Dwarves can be great because they have a lot of climate potential, so they have every climate in the game suitable. The Dark Elves don't have that, but they have an enormous amount of diplomatic potential. No one really hates the Dark Elves with the exception of the High Elves, and it's like, who cares really? Conquering Ulthuan is to your benefit ultimately. So you have a lot of diplomatic potential in your campaign as a result of that, leading to some very interesting campaigns and alliances that you can get as a result of that. And you also have Black Arc, so you can maintain a lot of armies far cheaper than other factions and just put them on a Black Arc and traverse across the sea and attack coastal settlements. And if you need to go inland, just recruit a lord from the settlement you just captured on the coast and transfer the army for a couple of turns. Sure, your upkeep will go up, but you will be able to manage it. So Dark Elves have a great deal of versatility in their campaign, diplomatically, militarily, even economically. They have a lot of choices, consequences, a lot of hero capacity that they can get pretty quickly in their campaign. So lots of fun to be had when you're playing a Dark Elf campaign. And I actually think they're far stronger in Warhammer 3 than they were in 2. More so in terms of the early game as opposed to the late game. Then we have a race that is just in a really bad spot in general, and that is, of course, the Dwarves. The Dwarves are an easy D tier. The only reason I'm not putting them in F is because I think there are far worse races, but the Dwarves are certainly in a bad spot. Their army works, which is not something I can say for necessarily some other factions. Like poor Daniel, he only has the demon units, which are crap. Well, he has a couple Immortal units, but he's primarily using demons, which are not great. The Dwarves have a strong army. They have the ability of getting more items than anyone else, but that's kind of where the benefits end. The economy is technically good, but you are paying a huge cost to build it up, and you're still building slower because the Dwarves have the weakest growth of any race in the game. The Oath Gold system is not that great of a system. The Grudge system is outdated. Like, the Dwarves are just one of these races that has never really been properly updated by Creative Assembly. A minor update, sure, but no major update that we've seen so far. And I guess we can hope that things do change with Thrones of Decay. And if they don't, well, that's a whole different kettle of fish that Creative Assembly is going to create if they don't fix the Dwarves, fix the Empire, and so on. Then we have the Empire. The Empire is absolutely an F tier race. They can work if you get a lot of warrior priests early on. Like, you start with archers, then you get a lot of warrior priests, and then you build up to artillery, demigryphs, great swords, hunters, huntsmen. But the problem is, like, every infantry unit that the Empire has in their entire roster is crap, with the exception of great swords. Their gunpowder units are worthless, like handgunners are worthless. Artillery, yeah, it's good, but you need tier 4 to get artillery. Heroes, only really warrior priest. Mages, of course, always add magic, but it's not like they have powerful mages. They don't have powerful mages. When I say that, I'm not saying the magic the mages are casting is weaker necessarily, but it's like the skill lines. The Empire, again, is a race that hasn't been updated in a long time, and they absolutely do need it. It's actually kind of sad because they did release a major update in Warhammer 2, and I think I would rather play the Empire as it was before the update in Warhammer 3. Like, in Warhammer 2 it kind of worked, but that's because the AI was more passive in Warhammer 2. Yes, I know, shockingly, the AI was actually more passive. Playing longer campaigns kind of worked out. The lecture counts didn't get instantly wiped out. And every Imperial campaign in Warhammer 3 is just bad, one way or another. The Imperial authority system that France and Gelt have to deal with is broken. The hostility meter is not that great. And Volkmar, who has technically the most playable campaign out of all of them, he has to contend with the issue of the Books and Nagash, and the Books and Nagash system is not great. And he also has a horrible starting position, having to deal with Manfred and potentially tic-tac-toe very early on with limited resources. Not a great situation, not a good early game, not a good campaign overall. There is some decent level of strength, but it's just that, it's decent. The Empire is never powerful, even if you do exceptionally well, unless you're playing as Volkmar and you get a lot of the Electrocount State Troopers and items and all the other benefits. Yes, then it can end up being pretty strong, but it's like other races just have that strength by default. So yeah, Empire, F tier. Greenskins, easy S tier. Greenskins are amazing in the early game, mid game, late game. They have a great deal of campaign potential, and to refute the accusations that I get in a lot of my videos, oh, you just want every race to be the same. No. If you look at the races I put in S tier, they play very differently than one another. Like, Castors are about industry, Dark Elves are about, yes, they are about early aggression, but they're also about using diplomacy and the potential of diplomacy. And Greenskins, they're really about smashing things up. They don't care about having an economy, they care just about being a steamroll, a freight train that is not stopping. That's the best way to play the Greenskins. That's how you build massive empires on the campaign map. And it's a playstyle that works exceptionally well for them, unlike some other races which should be like that. One particular other race that should be like that. Yes, I'm talking about Khorne. Like, you compare Greenskins versus Khorne, I'm gonna say it. Greenskins are far better warriors or followers of Khorne than Khorne actually is, because you have a race that is all about aggression. You have a race that's all about conquering territory and burning everything to the ground. That's what the Greenskins do. You don't want to take over territory necessarily intact. That's the worst decision you can make. You want to burn everything to the ground, sack it, basically reduce, like, sack it and then occupy it, then rebuild it because it's very, very cheap to do so. And you will gain a biblical amount of money. And while your economy is certainly decent enough, you don't really care about having a green economy. You're going to be in the red. You can be playing a Greenskin campaign where you're losing 30,000 gold every single turn, and you're not going bankrupt. That's the crazy thing. It's like playing in the red as the Greenskins is very effective. Like, just as long as you can fight 2 free battles every turn, or even 1 battle dependent on the elements, you will not go in the red as the Greenskins. And it works out for this aggressive smash and grab playstyle that the Greenskins should have. They're limited diplomatically, their climate is not necessarily the best, but their armies are very strong, their WA mechanic is strong, the double armies they get with the WA, the growth, the control, the hero capacity, very strong. Good unit roster in the early game, some of the most powerful tier 2 units, or the most powerful tier 2 units in the game with nasty skulkers, and fairly good endgame armies with black orcs and monster units. Easy S tier. Also, Grimgore. Then another A tier race, High Elves. Now, High Elves, you don't need me to say what makes them great. Like, their basic unit roster of Spearmen and Archers is one of the best rosters in Tier 1 in the entire game. Like, Cafe has better melee and Jade Warriors, but I'd say High Elves have a better early game army than the vast majority of people. They lack armor piercing, but overall, in terms of the threats that they're dealing with, the High Elves are in a really good spot. The question you might have is, like, why not rank them higher? Well, because they're slow to build up. So you look, so while the Castle will certainly fall in that category, there's just a limiting factor with the High Elves that never really goes away at any point in their campaign. You're always going to have to deal with limited hero capacity, you're always going to have to deal with the limitation of influence, and you're going to have to build buildings just to get access to research. So it's like a slow-going campaign. It takes a while to build up. Once you build up, you are one of the strongest races in the game. Like, the late game High Elves, easy S tier. The early game High Elves, and yes, strong, good, but not quite there, right? Just not quite there. Limitations, severe limitations on their campaign that weren't really as much of a problem in Warhammer 2, absolutely are a problem in Warhammer 3 from my perspective. That's really what drags them down. A great selection of legendary lords, great campaigns, just a kind of outdated, to a limited degree, design of the race, like just limitations of influence, limitation of heroes, lords, etc. It is a race that is much better if you take advantage of the load save character system, like saving a lot of characters and loading them up in a campaign so you don't have to pay influence for them. It ends up being better. But the fact that you can only really improve hero capacity by default at tier 4 is pretty problematic, really. So it's like you're just gonna have armies led by a lord with spearmen and archers. That's kind of it for much of your campaign, and never really changes that dynamic. Kind of feels a bit stale, but still a good race. Then we get Khorne. As I stated, I think, like, when we're talking about an aggressive expansionist race that wants to burn everything to the ground, the Greenskins are much better at that. Scarbrand gets an easy D tier. I'm not putting an MF, even though I think he kind of deserves it to an extent, but he's not as broken as the Empire or Daniel is, or some others. But here's the problem, from my perspective with Scarbrand. Yes, Scarbrand can win every battle he goes against if you abuse his mechanics, his charge bonus, etc, etc, etc. He can recruit Chaos Warriors, which are a decent enough tier 3 unit, and you can win the campaign with just one army. But that's it. You only have one army. Maintaining multiple armies as Scarbrand outside the Blood Host is not really a doable mechanic. So consider this. Like, I just want people to consider this. Just the difference between Greenskins and Scarbrand. In the Greenskin campaign, you have a dozen fucking armies that are actual armies. And then you double them up with a WAP. While the units that you get doubled up are not necessarily the great, they are a full fucking army that's attached to the main one. And those are dozens of armies that you can maintain properly. Scarbrand, in comparison, he gets the ability of, he will go bankrupt, start going bankrupt, trying to maintain a single army. His unit recruitment is one of the most expensive in the game. His upkeep is absolutely high, considering what he's dealing with, and Blood Hosts also screw him over with upkeep. Like, even from a demonic race standpoint, like, Nakari's cultist armies are far better than the fucking Blood Hosts that Scarbrand gets. And the worst part about it, Blood Hosts can't replenish. Now, you might ask why this is an issue. Well, if the whole idea of the campaign is that all the unique units and the main mechanic of the campaign is you're building blood toes, not having any kind of replenishment for that creates a major issue in the sense that you want to keep your blood toes for the battles that matter, but you still want to use them to win battles, so you end up in a situation where you are forced to fight a lot of battles manually. Now, if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to spend minutes of your life going through a loading screen, going in and out, doing that again and again and again, and also having a campaign where to play it the most optimally, you want to do it as quickly as possible before factions can build up, because if you let them build up, you will lose. So playing Scarbrand is all about aggression, but the problem is, you're going to end up fighting a lot of fucking tier 1 garrisons and tier 2 garrisons on your own, basically, with the tier 1 army. And that is not a great campaign dynamic. And it doesn't change. Like, in every Scarbrand campaign, you always want to do the same thing. Like, regardless of what you would do in the Battlelands, sure, there's some choices there, but you always want to teleport to the north, make your way to Ulf 1, wipe out Akari, wipe out Ulf 1, that's your fucking campaign. That's your victory conditions, by the way. It's not replayable. It's a one-pony trick, where the trick is, yes, you have blood toes, you have an army, you have a legendary lord that can wipe the floor with many others, and you have the movement range, but you can't take territory because it costs you skulls, so you're always suffering. You're always suffering economically as well, because to gain money as Scarbrand, which is the really stupid idea, like Beastmen, they gain money from raising settlements, the most money. Scarbrand gets the most money by sacking settlements, but that means he can't raise the settlements on the same turn, he can't move as much on the campaign maps. It ends up being just an awful campaign experience regardless of how you play it, if you're playing it repeatedly. Does it have power? Yes, it has power. But power alone, from my perspective, does not make for a good campaign experience. That's why I'm ranking Scarbrand D tier. Again, this is a point of disagreement between me and the community. Like, many people would actually just reverse these two races on this list, but I'm not here to just bend over to the Reddit meta. I've never been interested in that, nor will I change that. Anyway, the next race, also D tier, is Keyslav. Now, Keyslav is not quite as broken as the Empire is, but there is still in a pretty sorry state. The problem with Keyslav, the supporter system that Catherine and Castalton have to deal with, severely limiting their campaigns, devotion not being a great system, and crucially for Keyslav, economy. The Keyslav economy is pathetic. Yes, it has scalability. If you get a lot of different resource types and a lot of buildings, yes, you can earn a lot of money, but you're putting in significantly more effort. And not having money limits the number of armies you can have, the quality of those armies. So even if you're playing a powerful legendary lord of Keyslav like either Boris or Stankia, I find it weird when I look at a video from like Legend of Total War and he ranks Boris as the weakest of all of them. That's bizarre to me. But like, even if you're playing a Stankia or Boris Ursus, you are going to end up limited in the campaign because of that economy, and it's just like a significant hassle. I like Keyslav. Like, in terms of personal preference, I've probably played Keyslav campaigns the most out of any race in the game since Warhammer 3 came out. But it's like the issues are there, they're very significant issues, and they're just not gonna go away. They had the chance to fix those issues, they did not fix those issues. Thanks, Creative Assembly. Then we move on to the Lizardmen. Also a D tier race. There's going to be a lot of D tiers. Yes, I am going to go there. So Lizardmen are... No, actually, I think C tier. Like, I think Lizardmen kind of just barely make it. Like, Oxyotl is obviously far higher. But I think, like, Lizardmen, they're just kind of okay. They're not particularly bad. They have good heroes. Though, they're just not really in a great spot. They're boring. Like, I think that's one of the ways to describe them. They're just kind of boring to play. You just mass Horus, or if you're playing Oxyotl, you mass Skinks. That's basically your campaign plan, your entire campaign plan. You have limited hero capacity until you get to higher tiers, which is an issue, as I've stated before, for other races. And the Geomantic Web is just a dull mechanic. Also, this is one of the things that Lizardmen do suffer from. They just don't have great campaign mechanics, with the exception of Oxyotl, who really does a lot to make a mediocre race feel far better than it actually is, but like the base Lizardmen mechanics, they're just not great. On top of that, it's kind of annoying to play a race that's got jungle dominance, and it's like, they're not the best to traverse the fucking jungle. Skaven are, funnily enough. Like, Skaven, Dwarves, anyone who can use the underways. Yeah, like, jungles are slower. Like, why are lizardmen so slow to traverse the jungle where they should excel at? They own the jungle. It's just a bizarre situation. Then we get Norska. Norska is also a D-tier race. Now, Norska is an interesting case, because in theory they have the unit roster that can make it work. Yes, there are severe limitations. They could really use a DLC to flesh them out more in terms of lords, different lord choices. Yeah, that would be great, right, because they only have one. But really the problem with Norska is that their campaign dynamic is just broken, actually flat out broken. Like, their monster hunts, which are a pretty big deal of their campaign, is they're just bugged as hell, so they don't work. Furthermore, another thing about Norska is that you want to raise elements to the ground to sacrifice them to the chaos gods to build favor. Problem is, your economy is not that great, so you really need to rely on the income from sacking settlements. Yeah, but if you sack a settlement, you can't raise it. You get the idea. On top of that, Norska also wants to take settlements, so it's just not a great campaign dynamic. Like, when you have those kind of campaign systems interfering with one another, it doesn't lead to a great campaign experience, similar to Scarbrand. Then we have Nurgle. Yes, Nurgle, and I'm just gonna rank these in the order that I think they deserve to to be ranked as races. Now, I'm gonna say Scarbrand is better than Norska. At least his campaign mechanics work. So when we're talking about Nurgle. Actually, what would be worse, Daniel or Nurgle? I'm kind of curious to hear what people think. I probably would say Nurgle. Nurgle is a race that's got about a bunch of unique mechanics, the way they recruit units, like global recruitment based on a pool of units you get from structures, the way structures work with the cycle of life. It's just, it doesn't work because the structures themselves are significantly more expensive than anyone else, because you're paying all the upfront cost at once, which doesn't work in a campaign. You won't have money for it. Whenever you take a settlement, because of your unique structures, you will have to build up from scratch. Technically, you have a lot of diplomatic power because you can vassalize factions, but without being able to build structures cheaply, that's not really a workable situation. So Nurgle ends up being limited. You can make it work with a lot of hero capacity Nurgle does have, and using the Chaos Warrior units in Nurgle. But outside of that, it's just a really horrible campaign dynamic. And it's not just like, oh, Kugav has a horrible starting position. That's part of it, but it runs much deeper. It's just a fairly limited campaign. It didn't work that well in Realms of Chaos. It certainly doesn't work well in Immortal Empires. Then we have Ogres. Certainly would put them above Daniel and Kugav. Ogres, they're a race where they start out weak. They have a limited unit recruitment early on, with just variants of Ogre Bulls for a vast majority of their early game. Yes, you can potentially get Gorgers early on, but they're expensive. Iron Guts and Gorgers can work, but you're very limited because of the camp system. The Ogre economy, hero capacity is tied to camps, but you don't have a lot of camps in a campaign. So you end up in a situation where you're severely limited in campaign. Mods do help with this, but even then, it's just like the inherent race design is not a great one. And I'm not sure exactly what Creative Assembly was thinking about. Like, it's not fun playing with just Ogre Bolts. They're limited units. And while Ogres do have some really fun units later on that they can use, it's just like the early game and even mid game is quite miserable. You're going to have far fewer armies, far more limited economy. You're not going to be able to achieve a lot during the course of a campaign. Not recommended to play the Ogres. Then we have Skaven, another A-tier race. Now, Skaven have a lot of potential economically, not so much diplomatically. Everyone hates them, for a good reason, I might add. But here's some of the issues Skaven have. The benefits, really powerful artillery, assuming you count weapon teams as artillery. A great variety in terms of campaign, playstyles, like you can make a ranged army work, you can make an artillery or a weapon team army work, you can make a monster army work. But here are a few of the issues. One, everyone hates them, so diplomacy is difficult to get going. Two, their baseline units, Skaven Slaves and Clan Rats, are just freaking terrible. Actually, everything from the barracks, except Chieftains as heroes, are just flat terrible units that are never worth recruiting. Storm Vermin, Clan Rats, never worth bothering it with saying Skaven Slaves. So you end up with limited early game recruitment. Now, Skaven can make it work by, you know, spending food early on a settlement, getting tier 2, tier 3 units, and they do have the economic potential to make that work. The problem is, the real issue, is that their economy is tied heavily to them controlling large provinces, at least 3 settlements. That's because each Skaven structure generates some money. They don't have one structure generating money, they have a lot of structures generating money, but it's a lower sum. But the way it works is you build the structure in the provincial capital that increases the income. This is something Warriors of Chaos use as well. The issue is you do need to control those provinces, which can be a severely limiting factor in campaigns as a result of it. And they're also one of the worst races in terms of auto-resolve, dependent on the army style that you're using. The auto-resolve cares too much about goddamn armor and leadership, which is not a great situation that Creative Assembly should resolve. You can build Skaven armies that are good in auto-resolve, but they're still going to be limiting factors. But they're a perfectly functional, playable race. They're just not S tier from my perspective, though I'm not gonna lie, I've enjoyed playing a lot of campaigns as Skaven in Warhammer 3. Then we get Akari. Akari is a C tier. Here's the difference between Scarbrand and Akari. Akari has an economy. Akari has armies that are also disposable armies, but the way you gain those armies is in a better way. Akari also excels at diplomacy, and it is a really fun campaign with a lot of decision making in that campaign, diplomatically speaking, militarily speaking. Like, do you try and vassalize all of Wolf One, or do you burn it to the ground? Because you do have that choice. And it actually ends up being a great campaign experience, as opposed to Scarbrand, who just like you get bored out of your mind dealing with all the tier 1 garrisons that he's going to deal with and the weak armies. Akari is starting a war with all of Wolf One, and it is a brutal campaign, but it can be really fun. The problem, a lot of Akari's baseline units outside of the Champions of Chaos, which you can certainly take advantage of, and this list is assuming everyone has every DLC for every race. But the problem is, a lot of the Slaanesh units are very weak in terms of their armor. They'll take a lot of damage, they won't replenish so quickly. Now, you can make it work with certain units, but replenishment is always an issue in a Slaanesh campaign, forcing you to fight a lot of battles manually. Conquering Wolf One is fun. So in a short-term campaign, it can be a lot of fun, and you can actually have variety. You do have different choices in ways of dealing with it. But once you've done that, it gets boring pretty quickly, because you don't have armies that... You don't have armies where you can just, you know, take over a significant portion of the map, so you're going to have to fight a lot of meaningless battles manually again. And the vassal system, like, it's a great power, it's just kind of a dull mechanic, the way it ends up, because you build a lot of vassals, no one wants to declare war on you, your vassals can do a lot of the fighting for you. I think, like, Creative Assembly, what they did with the vassal system is a vast improvement compared to every other game they've had. But it's clear that the AI and the other systems in the game are not properly designed for it, to account for it. I keep thinking about other games that have diplomacy and how you need to how you manage allies in something like Nobunaga's Ambition or vassals in that game. Like, the vassal system in Warhammer 3 just feels pretty cheap. Powerful, but pretty cheap. Well, but still, don't get me wrong, having Alariel, Elfarian, and Tyrion on your side as vassals in your campaign annihilating the world is absolutely a fun experience. To a degree, but it is a one-time thing, I would argue. Then we get Tomb Kings, also a C tier. The problem with Tomb Kings is the early game issues, similar to the Beastmen. What makes them worse than the Beastmen is that Beastmen have a lot of things that can help them out in the early game, in the sense that they only need to hold one settlement, and that settlement is a nightmare to take, whereas Tomb Kings need to take a lot of settlements. Also, Beastmen can increase capacity by just fighting battles. Tomb Kings need to wait for that in the campaign, so their campaigns are even more restrictive than the Beastmen are. They have similar set of issues, but the Beastmen have some ways of overcoming that far faster and in a far better fashion than the Tomb Kings. Also, the Tomb Kings suck because the Books of Nagash system just sucks. Like, having to go take certain settlements, even potentially declaring war on allies, is not a great system. It's something that brings down Folkmar's campaign as well. Then we get Tzeentch. Yes, F tier. No, but what about the Changeling? He's a great campaign. No. The Changeling is a powerful campaign, that doesn't mean he's a good campaign. Far from it. The Changeling is a horrible campaign that isn't even necessarily that fun to play once, let alone repeatedly. Like, I've played the Changeling campaign once. It was fun to a limited extent, some of the quest battles and all that, experiencing those for the first time, but it's like, it's just a lot of grinding for very little game, because the impact of the schemes on the campaign map is very limited. And while sure you can play an entire campaign as the Changeling and never lose a battle and annihilate all of your opponents, you're not really accomplishing everything, because you don't want to annihilate your opponents. As for Kairos, he is unchanged since the launch of the game. Do I need to add anything more to that? I do not think so. Oh, but Kairos is really strong. Okay, I can see the point that Kairos can be strong because he can vassalize factions, he can get into a lot of money, but the way he's gaining a lot of money, let's just talk about that. Here's how you gain a lot of money as Kairos. You build your main economic structure in every settlement, then you build the modifier, 15% modifier in every settlement, and that's how you earn a lot of money. So that means 2 of your building slots in every settlement are going to be occupied by that. Yay, fun variety of settlements. Like, by the way, one thing to mention is Greenskins have this issue as well, but Greenskins have everything else that is in the campaign. Their unit roster, replenishment, campaign dynamic, just campaign dynamics, campaign mechanics in general are far better. Kairos' campaign dynamics are just meaningless. It's like, oh, changing away is going to be great. Not really. And the only reason the army isn't completely terrible is because the Champions of Chaos DLC. Also, Shadows of Change DLC. You can make it work with just one of those. You don't need to own both of them. I'd say Champions is actually more significant, though. Absolutely. To be sure, Shadows of Change does make a Kairos campaign better, but it's still awful overall. Like, the Changeling, he's strong, but he's boring. Kairos, he's not strong, but he's also still boring and forgettable. And it is a shame. I've tried playing many campaigns as Kairos, and it's not a question of succeeding. This is a point that I need to stress out. It's not a question of winning. You can win. It's the experience of winning. Like, the replenishment that Siege has is some of the worst in the game. I think it's easily the worst, because I think Barrier is interfering with that and making it worse. So, not a great experience to deal with on a campaign. Then we get the Vampire Coast, also an F-tier race. Let me just say this about the Vampire Coast. The Vampire Coast is one of those races could be great on the campaign map, except for 2 things. One, the way they increase their hero capacity requires them to build Pyre Coves, so you're not destroying settlements or conquering them, you're leaving them in control of the AI. This does limit your campaign. But besides that, and the weak economy from settlements, the real problem in the Vampire Coast, the reason they're F tier is not their economy or hero capacity. You could work with that. It's the fact that they literally have no army. Artillery? Yeah, that's good. Mortars, carronades, Queen Bess, absolutely really strong. But you don't have any unit that's worth a crap. Like, a couple of the monster units, sure, but that's about it. Like, all your infantry, all your range units, and quote-unquote cavalry, the units that stand in for cavalry, they're just worthless. You have a faction that makes it work with lords, heroes, and artillery, as well as a couple of monster units, but that's about it. Having a faction where the entire army roster is pathetic is exceptionally bad in my books. Like, even Daniel doesn't have it as bad as... even Daniel doesn't have it quite as bad as the Vampire Coast has it. And you can make it where you can make it work with RNS because she gets man-eaters, and if you own the Ogre Kingdoms DLC, and if you and you can also get Sartosa Free Company. But outside of that, fairly limited situation in their campaigns is an awful experience to play them. Then we get the Vampire Counts. I'd say the Vampire Counts are either B tier or A tier, though I'm leaning more towards putting them at B tier. They have some really strong Legendary Lords. Vlad, Isabella, Gorst. Though I think Gorst is representative with one of the problems that the Vampire Counts do have. He's fucking boring. Like, this is the thing about the Vampire Counts. They're strong, they're good, they're one of the races that have only received one DLC and yet have stayed relevant throughout the entire game, but their playstyle is awful. Like, Gorst is representative of that, because when you play as Gorst, it's like, you just recruit zombies, and recruit zombies, and recruit zombies, and it's like, every battle you have to fight manually because the auto-resolve is crap, and it's like, every battle is is a slugfest that lasts forever, which you can't lose. Rinse, repeat. It's better in with Vlad Isabella's campaign and Manfred's campaign, but not necessarily that much better. Having a race without any kind of artillery and very limited range units also doesn't do them any favors in sieges. You can make it work with a lot of heroes, and you can get a lot of hero capacity as the vampire counts, but yeah, there are some issues. For what it is worth, Vlad, Isabella, and yes, Manfred can be a lot better to play. It's not they're not a horrible race to play, but all the same, I would certainly argue that the vampire counts could use a couple of improvements, just for the sake of campaign variety, if nothing more. Or maybe a wall breaker unit, that would be nice, wouldn't it? Having more flexibility in sieges. Then we get to the last two races. Now, I want to make this point very clear about the Wood Elves and Warriors Cast. They are both S-tier races in terms of their strength. In terms of how their campaigns are fun to play, they're both F-tier. For the same reason, actually, surprisingly. Why is that? What is that reason, you might ask? Well, here's the reason. They both have very strong armies that are very difficult to defeat on the campaign. The warriors with their Warriors of Chaos, Hell Cannons, Demon Units, Dragon Ogres, etc. The Wood Elves with their Treekin, Glade Guard, Way Watchers. Both of them can annihilate factions on the campaign map, and they're very difficult to defeat on the campaign map. I don't think it is even feasible to lose the campaign as either the Warriors or Wood Elves, regardless of which Legendary Lord you're talking about. You would really need to screw up by the numbers to lose any campaign as either of them. Both of them have really strong Legendary Lords, great campaign variety, so on and so forth. Why are they F tier, you might say? Because the campaign has to have some level of fucking challenge and some level, something to it to make it interesting. So yes, if you want to play a campaign where you just steamroll everyone and vassalize them as the Warriors of Chaos, or make alliances with everyone as the Wood Elves, which by the way is very viable, because you take a lot of territory you don't give a shit about, so might as well just sell it to the factions that surround you, make everyone happy, and global alliances, the Wood Elves. Is thematic. Like, the sad part for both the Wood Elves and Warriors of Chaos, you can't really criticize Creative Assembly for what they did with these races, because it is thematic. It fits within the context of how these races should operate. It's just not fun. Like, I vastly prefer the Wood Elves and Warriors of Chaos to how they were before their reworks, but I think, like, Creative Assembly, one of the things they need to ask themselves going forward is, like, how can they make a campaign fun, interesting, and repeatable? Because a lot of us were glad when we got to experience the new Warriors of Chaos, for instance, with Champions of Chaos. Then it's like the playability. I think like the Warriors of Chaos are probably one of the least played races in the game right now, especially for veteran players, because it's like steamrolling the campaign map again and again and again with no challenge. Hell, as Scarbrand, at least you have to fight the battles. Say what you all about that, but at least you have to fight the battles. And oh boy, do you have to fight battles. With Elves, it's like. With Elves and Warriors, it's like you might have to fight a couple of battles, but it's actually quite feasible in almost all of their campaigns to play them without having to fight any battle, except quest battles, or only a handful of battles, where the auto resolve just won't work in your favor. But very few and far between. And when there's no level of challenge, when there's nothing to strive for, when there's nothing that's going to impede you in any way, shape, or form, it gets really boring, very tiring very quickly, and the replayability just isn't there. That's the problem with the Warriors of Chaos and Wood Elves. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.